Welcome back to Project Hippocampus. If you're new to the project, the overview is the first video in this playlist. This time I'll be telling the fourth of the 7 planned tales from the time of exploration, which spanned from 50 to about 50,000 YAA. So, let's begin. The Tale of the Lake Eater. The water of the lake lapped at the shore, turning the red speckled dirt into mud. Despite equine appetites, the reeds stretched skyward, while the star-shaped white flowers of the lilies floated peacefully on the still surface and blended with the fluffy white clouds reflected therein. Other aspects of the scene wouldn't have been as Hardhoof would have recognized. The shiny rocks had been ground into glittering dust, and the few scraps of once mighty towers that remained wouldn't have protected even the smaller horses, Lonos' descendants, from the midday sun. Thankfully, not only was the temperature less harsh than it was back in Hardhoof's day, but Lake Belly had her own solutions. She passed where Lightscent had once grazed and slipped into the cold water which instantly soaked her blood-bay fur. Yes, it was colder than she liked, but that was nothing resting against another member of her herd wouldn't fix. Lake Belly swam forward, feeling her hooves leave the muddy lake bed, being careful to keep the top of her muzzle above the water. The thin stems of pondweed brushed her cannons, and she drew a deep breath through her pink nose. She could feel a water current brush against her muzzle as a young Atlantic menhaden swam away, startled at the sudden motion. Even with her head under the water, it was easy for Lake Belly to locate the reeds that poked her in the muzzle. To her, and hopefully another as well, pondweed was preferable to overgrazed grass any day. Lake Belly paddled back the way she came, letting out an inviting whinny when her wide hooves touched the muddy lake bed again. A weak whinny came from the shore and quickly turned into a dry, hacking cough. Water dripped from Lake Belly's barrel as she approached stricken Joycall, who was lying down in the short grass. The mark of shared heredity was clear on Lake Belly and her younger sister. The ancestral stock of HCS-67 had been carefully selected by the humans. Their chromosomes, the tightly coiled bundles containing all of their genes, had been screened, and certain versions or alleles of these genes bred out of the population. But the humans were gone now, and millions of horses had mated without the interfering hoofless hands. Alleles they had suppressed were reappearing, one of which was a mutation on the 8th chromosome in a gene they had named T-Box transcription factor 3. Both of the sisters had inherited the mutated TBX3, as could be seen in their coats. Dark stripes rested across their spines and along their shoulders, but Lake Belly's muzzle was crossed by stripes, while Joycall's forehead was darker than the rest of her chestnut coat. Joycall's knees were striped as well above her white cannons, while Lake Belly's white fur extended halfway up her barrel. Joycall's chestnut barrel rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths, her ribs standing out against the reddish fur. Only the forward swivel of Lake Belly's ears caught her younger sister's greeting. Ever since the summer dryness had been replaced by cool rains, the chestnut mare had become more and more miserable. Her nose was crusted with yellow flakes. Lake Belly nibbled gently at Joycall's forehead, fighting the urge to shy away at the searing temperature. Lake Belly remembered feeling ill earlier in the fall, but she had never felt as unwell as Joycall clearly did. Why? She couldn't answer the question she had no words for, and just sank down on her belly to rest nearby, hearing Joycall breathe a little easier for the companionship. The small, gray-winged form of a janitor butterfly landed on Joycall's tawny hoof, and Lake Belly swished it away with her tail. Lake Belly hated janitor butterflies, an opinion which she figured many horses shared. She'd seen the bodies of horses, those who died to starvation or illness, with the telltale holes of the larvae dotting the hooves. The fluttering form seemed to like to land on Lake Belly for some reason, which always disturbed her. No, Joycall was going to be fine. Thankfully, she hadn't noticed, having begun to cough again. Lake Belly nibbled on her sister's mane, and Joycall sighed, resting her head back on the ground. A warning snort caught Lake Belly's attention, and she looked up, trying not to disturb Joycall. She had thought that it sounded like the herd stallion, and she'd been right. The familiar black-furred form was standing between a milkweed plant and their filly from last year. Young Quicksplash chattered her teeth at him. Though they had no predators, the instincts of prey animals told the stallion that he was being watched, and not just by Quicksplash. Seeing Lake Belly and Joycall, he nudged the bay filly toward them. Lake Belly didn't want her sister to be disturbed and got up carefully to go greet Quicksplash. Her father's rebuke had clearly bothered her, and she nuzzled against Lake Belly's barrel. Lake Belly began to groom her daughter's mane, barely noticing the dark dorsal stripe that they both shared. A sharp pain in the blood-bay's shoulder made her flinch, and Quicksplash shied away. When Lake Belly looked, she saw a small scar made of 3 spots on her shoulder that her daughter must have accidentally picked at. Oddly, Lake Belly didn't remember anything having injured her shoulder. A splash distracted Lake Belly's attention from her failed remembrance. She looked around for Quick Splash and saw that the filly was standing in the lake up to her striped knees. She was amusing herself by dipping her muzzle into the water almost up to where the white fur was replaced by bay and blowing bubbles. Lake Belly was glad that Quick Splash took after the blood bay herself rather than her father, who only swam occasionally. Lake Belly waded into the water, not knowing that her wide hooves helped her avoid sinking. She didn't consider it, and barely noticed the water currents from the odd little creatures that lived in the brackish lake. In addition to the yellow-scaled young fish, it was too early in the year for the adults to come in from the distant ocean. She had seen rarer little green and black ovals that never got larger than one of her ears. Those leeches were odd. Sometimes they bumped into her and pinched her skin. Hopefully, she and Quick Splash wouldn't encounter any. All this swimming and thinking was making Lake Belly hungry. She watched Quick Splash duck under the water and figured that she should do the same. Lake Belly was larger, though still small for a thoroughbred, and ventured deeper into the lake before pushing her head below the surface as well, treading water with her wide hooves. Pondweed brushed against Lake Belly's nose, and she clamped her teeth around it, pulling the thin stalks free from the riverbed. She lifted her head up, drawing a deep breath through her nose. The blood bay horse had to hold her head up high. She didn't want to get water up her nose or in her eyes. The delicious smell of fresh-cut stalks tempted her, but she wanted to be able to set her hooves down before she ate. Horses were terrestrial creatures, after all, and it took a lot of energy to tread water. Lake Belly savored the rich, crisp taste of the pondweed as she ate. Even at times when they'd had to leave the riverbank, the lead mare had led them across the, in some places, unusually hard dirt and past the short, oddly squared rocks toward the shore. Seaweed wasn't as good as pondweed to Lake Belly, it was far too salty, but she was glad to stay away from the inland portions of the world. Larger horses lived there, a few of them striped as she was, feeding as well as they could on the close-cropped grass. A splash distracted Lake Belly from her thoughts. She looked around and saw something that made her give a happy whinny. Joycall had ventured into the lake. The chestnut mare heard Lake Belly's greeting and started swimming over. Once the water reached her shoulders, Joycall stopped, breathing heavily through her nostrils. Lake Belly didn't notice until her sister called out to her, having already begun to look for more pondweed. Lake Belly swam back, shaking her mane and drenching both Joycall and the inquisitive form of Quick Splash, who had come over to see them. Quick Splash's ears pushed forward and she swam off. Lake Belly noticed the yellow sparkle of fish scales that had probably attracted her daughter's attention. A splash on her back and the familiar scratch of horse teeth caught Lake Belly's attention. Joycall had begun grooming her. It was a pleasant sensation, especially with the gentle lapping of the water against her fur. She couldn't reach Joycall's flank, but it was nice to be able to socialize in the water for Lake Belly, and she figured her sister probably felt similarly. Quick Splash tired herself out trying to follow the much more well-adapted lake dweller and began to paddle back to shore. Lake Belly started toward her, but Joycall slipped forward with a cough toward the struggling filly. The white blaze on her nose bumped against the filly's bay flank, and Lake Belly watched as both of them reached the shore together. Now that her daughter was safe, Lake Belly could indulge her own desire to keep swimming, and she did. She began to tread water, glad for the feeling of the current's flow through her mane. Something smooth touched her stifle, but her focus immediately shifted elsewhere when she heard Quick Splash squeal. Lake Belly began making her way back as quickly as she could, despite being unable to gallop in the water. By the time she reached the shore, she saw what had caused Quick Splash's fright. A leech, dark green with black lines and orange spots on its side, was inching away from the two horses back toward the lake. The sight made Lake Belly paw at the water, hoofs splashing unhappily. Naturally, she began to move a little faster after that. Quick Splash was standing uncertainly at the water's edge, tail clamped. Lake Belly sniffed her and thankfully couldn't find any cuts or smell of blood. The blood bay moved over to the chestnut, who was back to lying down, and scented the familiar metallic tang coming from 3 small wounds on her barrel. It was different and far more sinister than the metallic scent they'd all grown up with, that scent of rust and the teeth of time grinding buildings into dust. All 3 horses pinned their ears, and Quick Splash's eyes rolled. It wasn't the first time the 2 mares had seen such an injury. For some reason, Lake Belly ended up with them more frequently, but millions of generations as prey animals made the scent of blood a fearful thing. A memory from earlier in the day tugged at Lake Belly's mind, and she looked down at the healing cut on her shoulder. Yes, it did look similar. Where had she gotten it? Joycall coughed, resting her muzzle in the dirt, ears still pinned. Quick Splash was looking at the water, nostrils flaring. Half to support her stricken sister, and half to show her daughter that the danger was over, Lake Belly laid down next to Joycall and nibbled at her reddish mane. Eventually, the chestnut's ears relaxed, and she gave a deep sigh. Lake Belly flicked her tail at a janitor butterfly and yawned to release the stress of seeing the leech. Quick Splash stood at the shore of the lake, lapping at the water with ears pricked forward. Eventually, she too sensed that the danger was past and trotted off in search of her half-siblings to play with. The scene was so peaceful, despite Joycall's occasional coughing, that Lake Belly found her eyes closing. When she woke, the moon had risen, sparkling down on the surface of the lake. The night blindness which haunted the Appaloosas she couldn't meet had never even entered Lake Belly's mind as a concept. Joycall was awake as well and standing by the shore, coughing. She took quick little drinks, tail hanging wearily. Quick Splash was snoring, sound asleep, sprawled on her side with a striped ear flicking. Lake Belly wondered what she was dreaming about. The blood bay was still feeling too groggy to do much, but the instincts of prey animals prevented her from excessive lounging. She got up onto her hooves and shut her eyes again, dozing more lightly. Hoofbeats woke Lake Belly from her doze. The familiar chestnut form of Joycall was curled up again next to her, snoring. Lake Belly looked around and saw fresh hoofprints in the mud. From the distance between them, whoever made them had been drinking from the lake before being startled into a gallop. Quick Splash was still asleep in a sunbeam, and anyway the hoofprints were too large to be hers. Lake Belly decided to follow the prints, watching as they turned to clumps of mud once they left the shore. The ground was harder here, and in a few cases almost unnaturally so. She stepped over hard, flat rocks broken into pieces by the roots of oak trees. By the time the prince vanished, she noticed that the familiar form of her stallion was the one who had been galloping. A rival male had approached, and the two were shaking their manes at each other. The lead mare and her 2-year-old filly were watching from a safe distance, ears perked. Lake Belly had faith in her stallion and left him to his business. Lake Belly began to make her way back toward the water and whinnied a greeting at Quick Splash, who was trotting over. The filly returned it distractedly, seeming more focused on finding out what her half-sister was up to. Lake Belly half turned her head so that she could see behind herself. The strange stallion had left, and the victor had turned his head toward the ground and begun to graze, as had the lead mare. The filly whinnied at Quick Splash, who galloped over to join her. Lake Belly looked around further and saw the other two mares grooming each other in the morning sun, tails flicking idly. Their foals of this year were sleeping nearby. The peacefulness of the scene made Lake Belly's heart ache with the one who was missing. Lake Belly saw her still resting by the water, and as the blood bay approached, Joycall gave a weak whinny. The injury on her barrel had stopped bleeding and didn't seem to bother her. Lake Belly groomed her for a bit before hunger drove her back into the lake to search for pondweed. As the day turned to night, clouds gathered, blocking the setting sun. Quick Splash had joined her in the lake alongside the filly of the lead mare, who was watching from the shore. The first of the raindrops hit Lake Belly's muzzle, and she swam back toward the lead mare, shaking the water out of her striped fur. Joycall coughed as she got to her hooves, and the sisters made the walk inland together, the two fillies following. The lead mare was sheltering under a large oak, so they joined her. Rain beat down on the tree, whispering through the leaves and occasionally landing on the horses' backs and making them shiver. They pressed together, trying to keep warm against the biting wind, sheltering their faces and the fillies with their stifles, turning their backs to the howling storm. The storm lasted for a few days, during which the horses occasionally ventured into the icy rain in search of grass before retreating back into the shelter of the herd. Finally, the sun peeked through the still green leaves of the old oak. Lake Belly gave a relieved stretch and noticed the stallion standing near the lake. She could see him shaking the stiffness from his legs, and did the same, trying to ignore the slight creakiness she felt in her joints after such unpleasant weather. The lead mare trotted toward the other two mares, and Lake Belly joined the stallion for a few sips of the lake. Thirst slaked, she trotted past him, and was enjoying feeling the water against her knees when a slightly crackly greeting whinny made her turn her head. Joycall was moving toward her at a trot that made Lake Belly's heart skip a beat, given the chestnut's sickly condition. Lake Belly whinnied to her, nibbling at her mane as the coughing horse paused to catch her breath. She was apparently feeling a lot better today. Lake Belly splashed her way into the lake up to her shoulders, and Joycall joined her. After a particularly fierce cough, the white blaze on Joycall's muzzle dipped below the surface, and she came back up with pondweed between her teeth. Once they had both fed, Lake Belly paddled further into the lake. She could hear Joycall following, and paused to see the relaxed tilt of the chestnut's ears. Joycall noticed and began to tread water too, and the two sisters paused to relax. Lake Belly enjoyed the brush of the lilies against her face and the sweet scent of the flowers. The sound of the wind was broken only by Joycall's occasional coughing. Eventually, Joycall tired, though they had stayed out longer than Lake Belly had thought she'd be able to. It was so good to see Joycall's strength returning. When they were standing in the mud again, Lake Belly noticed with alarm a dark green leech clinging to Joycall's right shoulder. The older sister was about to call a warning when it dropped off into the water and disappeared into the mud churned up by the horses, leaving blood dripping down through the reddish fur. Both horses froze in alarm, nostrils flared, and too aware of the metallic scent. They left the water quickly, and both silently agreed that they were exhausted. When they slept, they did so curled up together again, though to Lake Belly's relief, Joycall coughed far less than she had a few days before. Joycall's cough began to fade along with the green of the oak leaves as the days passed. Lake Belly mused on this, waking from her doze by the shore upon hearing Quick Splash and Joycall splashing happily in the shallows, since it was too cold to venture far into the water. Joycall had been feeling better after she had started going swimming more. Did the water help, or was it something within? Either way, what she should do was clear. Lake Belly stepped forward, her wide hooves helping keep her from sinking in the mud, feeling the cold water against her fetlocks, and joined Quick Splash and Joycall. Thanks for watching! Hope you enjoyed this one, and if you really enjoyed it, subscribe so you'll know when the next tale from the time of exploration is released. See you then!